Good morning, church. It's great to see you all here this morning. Thank you all for singing out. Thank you just for your encouragement, by your presence being here today. I'm excited to share our lesson here with you all here today. For any of our visitors who are here, I would like to say welcome. We're so thankful that you have chosen to be here. We know that you could be anywhere in the world, and so we are so thankful that you have chosen to be here at the Church of Christ, which meets at Holmes Road. Today, we are going to be in our third lesson in our series here called Leaving is Believing. And in this series, what we're focusing on is people who leave things of great significance, things that are really important in order to follow God. And so what we're going to do and see in this series is that sometimes leaving is believing, that sometimes the best thing you can do for your faith and for your walk with God is to leave, and I hope that we can see that here in our story today. And so how this is going to work is that we're going to focus on two questions here today. The first question being, what is it that the person leaves? So what do they leave behind? And the second question is, what makes that act of leaving an act of believing? So these are the two questions that we're going to focus on here today. So if you have your Bibles, please join me in John chapter 4. I don't have the verses on the screen this morning. We have a pretty lengthy reading. So if you want to follow along, we're going to be in John chapter 4, and we're going to start in verse number 1. John chapter 4, starting in verse 1. John chapter 4. This is the word of God. Now Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that he was gaining and baptizing more disciples than John, although in fact it was not Jesus who baptized, but his disciples. So he left Judea and went back once more to Galilee. Now he had to go through Samaria. So he came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground Jacob had given to his son Joseph. And Jacob's well was there. And Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. It was about noon. When a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, "Will you give me a drink?" His disciples had gone into the town to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "You are a Jew, and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink? For Jews do not associate with Samaritans." Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." "Sir," the woman said, "you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where can you get this living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did also his sons and his livestock?" Jesus answered, "Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give them will become in them a spring of water, welling up to eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so that I won't get thirsty and have to keep coming here to draw water." He told her, "Go, call your husband and come back." "I have no husband," she replied. And Jesus said to her, "You are right when you say you have no husband. The fact is, you have had 5 husbands, and the man you now have is not your husband. What you have just said is quite true." "Sir," the woman said, "I can see that you are a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem." "Woman," Jesus replied, "believe me, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews. Yet a time is coming and has now come when the true worshipers will worship the Father in the Spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks. God is Spirit, and his worshipers must worship in the Spirit and in truth." The woman said, "I know that Messiah, called Christ, is coming. When he comes, he will explain everything to us." Then Jesus declared, "I, the one speaking to you, I am he." Just then his disciples returned and were surprised to find him talking with a woman. But no one asked him, what do you want? Or why are you talking with her? Then leaving her water jar, the woman went back to the town and said to the people, "Come and see a man who told me everything I ever did. Could this be the Messiah?" They came out of the town and they made their way toward him. Okay, now skip down to verse 39. Many of the Samaritans from that town believed in him because of the woman's testimony. He told me everything I ever did. So when the Samaritans came to him, they urged him to stay with them, and he stayed 2 days. And because of his words, many more became believers. They said to the woman, "We no longer believe just because of what you said. Now we have heard for ourselves, and we know that this man really is the Savior of the world." Okay. So Jesus and his disciples have just traveled roughly 40 miles from Judea to Samaria. So understandably, Jesus is tired. So he sits down at the well and he speaks to a Samaritan woman and he tells her her story. And she is so convicted by this story that she forgets her original purpose for being at the well. And so she leaves it behind. She goes back home and she testifies to her whole town about this prophet named Jesus. And at her testimony, they believe. This story is so powerful, and I'm so excited to share it with you here today. So did you all notice what she left behind? Did you catch it? And in verse 28, we find out what she leaves. We're told that verse 28, then leaving her water jar, the woman went back to the town and said to the people. So she left her water jar. This is what she left behind. Now, I know this is a little anticlimactic. She doesn't leave her family or her job or her livelihood, like Abraham or the disciples did, right? But I want to explain to you why this is a big deal and why, in fact, this is an act of believing. So first of all, this conversation probably should have never happened in the first place. It probably should never happen. We should have John chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, skip chapter 4, and then move on to chapter 5 and 6 and so on. This conversation probably should have never happened. And here's why I say that. Because Jesus, he breaks the rules here. Jesus, as a Jewish rabbi, is found speaking publicly to a woman. Jewish men don't talk to strange women publicly. Jewish rabbis are not to speak publicly with unknown women. And this is why the disciples are so surprised to find him talking to her in verse 27. Because this is not supposed to happen. In the Mishnah, which is a highly regarded Jewish book on behavior and lifestyle, it explicitly warns against spending too much time with women for two reasons: for temptation and the appearance of impropriety. Okay, so this conversation probably should never happen. And now, this is strike one. So secondly, this woman had a bad reputation. Right? She's not only had one husband or two husbands, she's had 5 husbands, and the man she's with now is not her husband. She has a really bad reputation. She's not winning any popularity contests. The wives of the town, whenever she comes around, they keep their husbands a little closer whenever she comes around, right? She has a really bad reputation. If you remember when Jesus, when he was invited into the house of the Pharisee, Simon the Pharisee, a woman of ill repute came into the house, and she poured oil on Jesus, and she wiped his feet with her tears and with her hair. And when Simon the Pharisee saw this is what he said when he saw this happening. He said, "If this man were a prophet, he would have known who and what sort of woman this is who was touching him, for she is a sinner." So Jesus is criticized because he allows an unknown woman of ill repute to interact with him. As a Jewish rabbi, you're not supposed to do this. This is not supposed to happen. Because he has a reputation that he has to uphold. And given her background, this is not a good look. All right, so this is strike number 2. Thirdly, not only should Jesus not be speaking to her because she is a woman or because she is a woman of ill repute, but Jesus should not be speaking to this woman because she is a Samaritan woman of ill repute. And the one thing we know about Jews and Samaritans is that they do not like each other. They do not get along. There is bad blood here. And she even says this herself in verse 9. She says, "You are a Jew, and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink? For Jews do not associate with Samaritans." And so this tension goes all the way back to the Old Testament. So after the northern kingdom in Israel, with its capital at Samaria, when it fell to the Assyrians, most of the Jews living in Samaria at that time were deported back to Assyria. And the king of Assyria, when that happened, he brought foreigners into Samaria in order to help to settle the land and to keep the peace. And so when this happened, when the foreigners came, the remaining Jews who were there left in Samaria intermarried with these foreigners. And this resulted in the mixed race that we now call the Samaritans. So this is where they come from. They were Jews who intermarried with foreigners. And because they intermarried, Jews regarded them as impure. They weren't pure Jews because they had intermarried with these foreigners. So the pure Jews, they hated this mixed race of people called the Samaritans because they were impure. And they also felt that they had betrayed their people and they had betrayed their nation as well. So this is where their hatred comes from. They weren't pure Jews and they were viewed as traitors. But not only that, the Samaritans said that the holy place where God is to be worshipped is in Samaria on Mount Gerizim, not in Jerusalem. And again, she says this in verse 20. She says, "Our ancestors worship on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem." The tension was so thick that in 128 BC, so roughly a little over 100 years before Jesus was born, the Jews attacked Samaria, they destroyed their city, and they burned down their temple in Samaria. Jews had so much dislike for the Samaritans that they generally would not even travel through Samaria. If they had to go through Jerusalem, they would go out of the way and avoid traveling through Samaria altogether. They would rather add more miles to their trip, more hours in order to get to their destination before they would travel through Samaria. That's how much they hated them. So when you add all these things together, this conversation probably should have never happened. Jesus, as a Jewish rabbi, should not be speaking publicly to this woman because she is a woman, she has a bad reputation, and probably most importantly is that she's a Samaritan. You know, this is why the story of the Good Samaritan is such a big deal, because you would not expect a Samaritan to help out a Jew in this way. That's why that story is so powerful. Now, having said all that, what's interesting to me in this story, knowing what we now know about Jews and Samaritans, is what John says in verse 4. This is what John says in verse 4. He says, Jesus had to pass through Samaria. Jesus had to pass through Samaria. Now, wait a minute. What is that about? Why would John tell us that Jesus had to pass through Samaria when we know that he could have taken an alternative route? In fact, it was customary to take an alternative route. So why would John tell us that Jesus had to pass through Samaria when we know that he could have went a different way? Jesus meets this woman where she is. He tells her story. She is so convicted, she leaves her water jar behind and she tells everyone about Jesus. Man, how I wish we had more Christians who would testify about Jesus like this woman. So let's answer our second question here this morning. We've already answered the first. We know what she left behind. She leaves her water jar behind. So now let's take a look at what makes this an act of believing. Okay, let me give you several things here. First of all, she recognizes Jesus as a prophet. In verse 19, she says, "Sir, I can see that you are a prophet." Now normally this wouldn't be such a big deal for someone to see Jesus and to recognize him as a prophet, But the reason that this is an act of believing is because this woman has no framework for placing Jesus as a prophet. Because the Samaritans only had 5 books in their Bible. Only 5. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. That's all they had, the Torah. They did not believe there were prophets such as Amos or Isaiah or Micah. They only had 5 books in their Bibles. The only prophet she knows about is Moses in the book of Exodus. And yet she recognizes Jesus as a prophet sent from God with no biblical framework, with only 5 books in her Bible. She recognizes Jesus in the way that even the spiritual leaders of the day did not recognize him as. The Pharisees and the Sadducees, with no framework. In fact, the very last thing Jesus says to her before she goes back home and testifies about him is this. In verse 26, Jesus says to her, he says, "I, the one speaking to you, I am he." Now, in Greek, the pronoun he does not exist. It is not there. It is only there for our sake and for clarity, which means that the last thing Jesus says to her is, "I, the one speaking to you, I am. I am." That's the last thing that he says to her. He reveals to her the same name that God reveals to Moses in the burning bush on Mount Sinai. And she hears that, and she goes home, and she testifies about Jesus. She recognizes Jesus as a prophet, as the great I am. She leaves her jar at the well, and she goes back home, and she tells them about this prophet named Jesus who has come to their town with no biblical framework. What amazing belief. This is why leaving is believing. Let me give you a second one here. She leaves her shame at the well. She abandons her shame. So she comes to the well by herself at noon, about 12 o'clock, an unusual hour. Now, the normal time to draw water was either in the morning or in the evening, during the cooler parts of the day, not 12 o'clock. And normally, the women would travel together in groups to draw water, and they would not usually travel alone, especially not in the midday heat. So this woman is coming to draw water at a time when no one else would normally be at the well, probably because of the shame she has, the guilt that she feels, or the embarrassment because of the lifestyle she lives. Maybe she's been ostracized because of her behavior and her reputation. She hasn't lived a very moral life. She's intentionally trying to be avoided here. And yet she encounters Jesus. She forgets whatever shame she has. She leaves it at the well. She goes home and she tells the people about Jesus. Think about the baggage she has, right? She's the talk of the town, and not in a good way. She leaves her guilt and her embarrassment and her shame behind to testify about Jesus, despite the baggage. And in an honor-shame culture, think about the amount of belief that must have taken for her in order to do that, to overcome this social stigma of the day in order to leave. This is why leaving is believing. Let me give you a third one here. She testifies about Jesus publicly. She publicly testifies about Jesus. Verse 28, then leaving her water jar, the woman went back to the town and said to the people, "Come, see, a man who told me everything I ever did. Could this be the Messiah?" Now here's why I make a big deal about this. In the first century, women were not regarded as credible witnesses. Women were lowly esteemed, and their testimony was regarded as questionable. It certainly wasn't as credible as a man's testimony in the first century. Now, this attitude towards the testimony of women is evident in history. So the Jewish historian Josephus, he even writes about this in the public court of law for admissible testimony regarding women. He says this: "Let not the testimony of women be admitted on account of the levity and boldness of their sex." Here's another one from the Talmud. "Any evidence which a woman gives is not valid to offer. Also, they are not valid to offer." So let me just say that this is not the Bible, okay? This is not in the Bible. This is just a reflection of the sort of the patriarchal society at the time in the first century, that men had a low view of a woman's testimony. Now, having said all that, she has no credibility because she's a woman. And with her reputation, she certainly doesn't have any credibility. And yet, despite this fact, she leaves her shame at the well. She goes home and she publicly testifies about Jesus. She completely disregards this social stigma of her day. She says, come and see the Messiah. She can't help but to testify about the great I am. Not only does she leave her water jar, she leaves her shame, her guilt, her embarrassment at the well, and she testifies about Jesus. She knows that her testimony is not highly regarded, but yet and still, she testifies anyway. She's known in this story more for the fact that she's had 5 husbands, and she didn't even have a name in this story. And yet it's because of her testimony that they believe in Jesus. What a powerful story. Again, this is why leaving is believing. Now, I want to close this morning this way. I want to close by illustrating this idea that leaving is believing to you with the illustration. And I want to do so by sharing a story that is familiar to all of us. You've all heard of Goldilocks and the 3 bears, right? We've all heard of that story. Well, have you ever heard of Goldilocks and the 3 dinosaurs? So this is a retelling of the story by an author named Mo Willems. And in this story, he tells the story of Goldilocks. Instead of encountering 3 bears, she encounters 3 dinosaurs. So in the story, Goldilocks ends up wandering into the home of 3 dinosaurs that they're actually trying to lay a trap for her. So this is how the story goes. The 3 dinosaurs, they want to turn her into a little girl bun, a little chewy bun snack. And so they want to eat a bunch. They want her to eat a bunch of chocolate pudding, so that she'll be full of chocolate pudding, and that they can turn her into a nice, yummy snack. You can go to the next slide, please. So they set the trap. You can hit the next slide. They make 3 bowls of chocolate pudding, and they set the pudding out on the counter, and they leave the house and they go hide in the woods. You can hit the next slide. They go over one more. They go one more. Okay. And Goldilocks, she is blissfully unaware of this trap that these 3 dinosaurs have set up for her. And so she ends up wandering into the house, and she steps into the trap. And so she smells this yummy chocolate pudding, and she goes up to the counter, and she sees 3 bowls of chocolate pudding. And the first bowl is too hot. The second bowl is too cold. And the third bowl is just right. But she eats all of it anyway, because hey, when it comes to chocolate pudding, I mean, it doesn't matter if it's hot or if it's cold, right? So she eats all the chocolate pudding, and she's stuffed. But then as she looks around, she looks for a place to take a nap and rest for a little bit, she realizes that everything in the house is not to scale for the bear's house. Like the chairs are just way too big. The beds they're humongous. The first bed is too big. The second bed is too big. And the third bed is too big. And so eventually, Goldilocks kind of thinks for a minute and she realizes, hey, wait a second. This isn't the bear's house. This is some dinosaur's house. So when she realizes that she's in the wrong house, she runs out the back door. Now, when she runs out the back door, the dinosaurs come rushing in, and they realize that they have just missed her. And so they're sad, of course, because Goldilocks has just escaped, and they're not going to be able to eat their little chocolate pudding filled chewy bun snack anymore, So they're sad about it, and that's the end of the story, pretty much. Now, the reason that I tell you this story is because I think this story has two morals, and I think it relates to our story here, our lesson here today. So the first moral of the story is for the dinosaurs, and that is lock the back door. All right. So I think that's pretty good. Right? Pretty good advice, right? If they would have locked the back door, then they probably could have had their little chewy girl bun snack if they just locked the back door. The second moral is the main moral of the story, and this is for us today. That I just think it is pretty powerful, and you'll hear why. And it's connected to our lesson in this way. The second moral of the story is this: if you ever find yourself in the wrong story, leave. If you ever find yourself in the wrong story, leave. Remember earlier, I asked the question, why does John tell us that Jesus had to pass through Samaria? Right, when we know that he could have taken an alternative route, he could have gone around instead of going through. Why did John tell us that he had to pass through Samaria? I believe that it was necessary for Jesus to pass through Samaria in order to call this woman to leave the wrong story and invite her into the right story. When Jesus walked around the ancient world, he would find people who were living the wrong story, and he would invite them to follow him and to live the right story. He would say, hey, you're living the wrong story. Come out. Come follow me. You're in the wrong kingdom. You're in the dinosaur's house. Come in the bear's house. Come out and follow me. When we find Zacchaeus, and Zacchaeus is living the wrong story, Jesus invites him to step out of that story and to live the right story. When he finds a woman caught in adultery, he calls her out of that story. When he finds a woman here at the well, he says, hey, step out of that story. Come follow me. Jesus is consistently finding people who are living the wrong story, and he's inviting them to leave and step into the right story. And while Goldilocks was in the kingdom of the dinosaurs and darkness and death, right? When she realizes that where she is not the right place, she takes actions and she leaves. She leaves that kingdom and she goes to the story that she's supposed to be in, the story that she belongs to. So when we talk about Jesus in this way, church, that's good news, y'all. That's good news that Jesus invites us into his story, the right story. That he invites us to the right story to help people to be liberated from darkness and death and the trap of sin. This is why leaving is believing. Now, I don't know what happened to this woman in John chapter 4. The Bible doesn't tell us. But I like to think that, like Goldilocks, she left the wrong story and she accepted Jesus' invitation to live the right story. That's what I like to think that she did. So this morning, Jesus is inviting you to live the right story. If you find yourself living in the wrong story this morning, Jesus is calling you out of that story. He's calling you out of death, darkness, and despair. And he's inviting you into the story of life, liberty, and love. So if you find yourself needing to leave something behind, don't wait. Don't wait. Leave your shame right where you are. Leave your guilt right where you are. Leave your embarrassment right where you are, like this woman did, and come to Jesus, the great I am. If you have any need this morning, why don't you come as we stand and as we sing?